Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The Bone Marrow Donation Center was supposed to be my last realistic shot at fast money, the kind where you walk in broke and walk out just barely keeping your life from falling apart. I needed exactly $1,000, not a dollar more, not a dollar less, just enough to keep the lights on and cover one more month of rent so my landlord wouldn't tape another warning notice to my door. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed with that soft, annoying hum as I sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table, rolling up my sleeve and trying to act like this was just another routine medical thing instead of a financial Hail Mary. The nurse had already taken a few vials of my blood and walked out with them in a little plastic tray, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the faint smell of antiseptic, while I silently counted down the minutes until I could sign whatever forms they needed, collect my compensation check, and get out of there before my parking time ran out. I was already mentally spending that money on overdue bills when the exam room door suddenly swung open like someone had shoved it a little too hard. Dr. Randall Thorne rushed back in, and I could tell right away something was off, because this time he wasn't alone. 2 security guards came in right behind him, one on each side like they were his escort, their hands resting lightly near their radios as if they were expecting trouble but hoping they wouldn't need to call it in. The doctor's face had gone completely pale, so white it looked like someone had pulled every drop of blood out of him and left only worry behind. His hands trembled as he clutched my medical chart tightly against his chest, the papers inside rattling faintly. "Mr. Brennan Wade," he said, and I heard his voice crack right on my name like it didn't know how to leave his throat. He swallowed, cleared his throat, and tried again, forcing his professional tone back into place. "Mr. Wade, I need you to stay calm while I explain something." "What's going on?" I asked, sliding off the edge of the examination table and taking a couple of instinctive steps back until my shoulders brushed the cold wall, my body reacting before my brain could catch up. "Is there something wrong with my blood? Am I sick? Is this about some disease?" Dr. Thorne shook his head slowly, side to side, in this careful way that made my stomach clench even tighter. His eyes locked onto mine like he was afraid I'd bolt for the door. "Your DNA is flagged in a federal database," he said quietly. "According to the records we use, you died in 1981. The words hit me like somebody had walked up and punched me right in the chest, knocking the air out of me. For a second, I just stared at him, waiting for him to say it was a joke, some glitch, anything, and then I let out this sharp, shaky laugh that bounced around the sterile white room and sounded way more nervous than amused. "That's impossible, Doc," I said, trying to joke but hearing the wobble in my own voice. "I was born in 1982. I'm pretty sure I'd remember being dead before I got here." "I understand how insane this sounds," Dr. Thorne replied, taking a slow step closer while the security guards stayed planted near the door like living bookends. "But the match is undeniable. The system flagged you as soon as we ran your genetic markers through our standard screening protocol. This isn't something we can just ignore." "Then your system messed up," I shot back, feeling my heartbeat climbing higher and higher, that fight-or-flight instinct kicking in so hard I could feel the adrenaline buzzing in my fingertips. "I'm Brennan Wade. I've been Brennan Wade for 43 years. I've got a social security number, a driver's license, tax returns, traffic tickets, you name it. I have an entire life that proves I'm not dead." Before Dr. Thorne could respond, the door opened again, much slower this time, and 2 men in dark suits walked in with the kind of controlled calm you only see in movies about law enforcement. Everything about them screamed federal agents. The neat regulation-style haircuts, the plain ties, the serious expressions, the way they moved like they'd rehearsed this 100 times before. The older one, a black man with silver streaking his temples and lines around his eyes that said he'd seen a lot, reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge, flipping it open in one smooth motion. "Mr. Wade, my name is Agent Raymond Holt with the FBI," he said, his voice steady and official. "This is Agent Derek Polson. We need you to come with us immediately." "The FBI?" I repeated, my voice jumping up an octave like I'd just inhaled helium. "For what exactly? Donating bone marrow while supposedly dead?" Agent Holt didn't crack a smile, didn't even twitch. His face stayed completely serious as he slipped his badge back into his jacket. "Your DNA matches a cold case from 1981, he said. "A missing child who disappeared 43 years ago. The kidnapping victim's family is one of the wealthiest in America." The room tilted for a moment, like the floor was sliding sideways under my feet, and I grabbed onto the edge of the examination table just to keep myself grounded. "You've got the wrong person," I managed, shaking my head over and over like I could knock the idea loose. "I'm nobody. I'm just a failed landscaper from Denver who can't even keep up with his utility bills. I'm not some missing rich kid from a crime show." Agent Polson, the younger one with sharp blue eyes that looked like they scanned and cataloged every detail in the room, stepped forward and held up a tablet. "The DNA match we're seeing is 909% conclusive," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Mr. Wade, the infant who disappeared was named Theodore Augustus Ashford III. He was 3 months old when he vanished from his family's Connecticut estate, and hearing that name attached to me made my legs feel like they might give out on the spot." "The Ashfords are worth approximately $2.8 billion, Agent Holt said, watching my face like it was a live bomb he was trying to defuse. "They've never stopped looking for their son. If all of this is confirmed, you stand to inherit everything. The entire fortune, the estate, the social position, every single thing that was taken from you 43 years ago." My knees suddenly forgot how to do their job, and I dropped back onto the examination table like my strings had been cut, my brain refusing to accept that any of this was real. "But you just told me I died in 1981, I said, hearing my own voice come out thin and shaky. "How am I supposed to be this missing kid if the official record says I've been dead for decades?" "That's exactly what we need to figure out," Agent Holt replied. "Someone wanted the world to believe Theodore Ashford was gone. Whoever did this went to incredible lengths to hide you in plain sight, to build a whole new identity around you as Brennan Wade. The real mystery here is who did it and why." Dr. Thorne finally seemed to pull himself together enough to speak again. "Mr. Wade," he said quietly, "in 20 years of practicing medicine, I've never encountered anything remotely like this. The federal database does not make errors on something this serious. It just doesn't happen." My thoughts jumped straight to my parents, Dorothy and Mitchell Wade, probably sitting in their Florida retirement condo right now, watching daytime game shows and arguing lightly over whose turn it was to walk the dog. I pictured my brother, Colton, on some noisy job site in Colorado Springs, wearing his hard hat and barking orders over the sound of power tools. Those were my people. That was my family. That was the life I understood. "This is completely insane," I said, but even as the words came out, little memories started sliding into place, like puzzle pieces I'd been ignoring for years. I remembered how I never really looked like either of my parents, not in the way most kids do. No same nose, no matching eyes, nothing that made people say, "Oh, you're definitely Mitchell's boy." I remembered flipping through old photo albums and noticing there were no pictures of my mom pregnant with me, not one, even though she had photos of everything else, from random holidays to backyard barbecues. I remembered how they always got strangely quiet when I asked about the day I was born, how they'd quickly change the subject to something safe like school or sports or church. At the time, I wrote it off as them being awkward about medical stuff. Now it felt like something else. Agent Holt pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen before looking back up at me. "We have a car waiting outside," he said. "We need to move quickly. If you really are Theodore Ashford, there is a real possibility that the person who orchestrated your disappearance is still alive. And if that's true, they might not want you turning up after all these years." "Am I under arrest?" I asked, feeling my throat tighten. It was a simple question, but part of me was terrified of the answer. "No," Agent Polson said immediately. You're not under arrest, but you're not safe here anymore either. The second your DNA report hit the system, it triggered automatic alerts across several agencies. By this point, there are probably people in Connecticut already whispering that Theodore Ashford might still be alive. News like that travels fast. The media will swarm this story within hours." I looked around the tiny examination room, taking in the disposable gloves, the blood pressure cuff, the little sink in the corner, all the normal things that had turned into background noise. A place that, 10 minutes earlier, was just another medical office now felt like the starting point of an earthquake ripping my life in two. 43 years of being Brennan Wade, and suddenly I was being told that might all be a carefully built lie. But the alternative sounded even more ridiculous. How was I supposed to accept the idea that I could be the heir to one of the biggest fortunes in the country when I couldn't even come up with next month's rent without selling my blood and bone marrow? "Mr. Wade," Dr. Thorne said gently, taking a tiny step closer. "Or whoever you truly are beneath that name. You walked in here today because you were desperate for money. If what these agents are telling you is accurate, your financial problems are gone. Your entire world is about to be turned upside down." He paused, looking me straight in the eye, and what he said next sent a chill right through me. "The real question is whether you're ready to find out who you actually are." 6 months ago, I would have laughed in his face if he'd said something like that. 6 months ago, I thought I had my life mostly figured out. Wade Landscaping employed 12 solid workers, folks who depended on me for paychecks, and we served over 200 regular clients all across the Denver metro area, from small front yards to big commercial properties that took whole crews to maintain. I'd built that company from absolutely nothing, starting with a beat-up old pickup truck my uncle sold me cheap and a borrowed lawnmower that stalled every other yard, pushing through those early years 1 yard at a time until I had a real business I could point to and say, I built that with my own hands. My wife, Melanie, handled the books and invoices from a little home office we squeezed into a corner of the living room, making sure suppliers got paid and customers got billed, while also somehow keeping our household from collapsing into chaos. Our daughter, Skyler, only 15 but way ahead of her age when it came to technology, had designed our website from scratch and ran our social media pages, posting before and after pictures of lawns, flower beds, and clean walkways that made our work look like something out of a catalog. We weren't rich, but we were steady. We ate dinner together most nights around the kitchen table. We argued about normal stuff, schedules, grades, stress, money. But under it all, I really believed we were that classic American family business, the kind they show in those feel-good commercials during the Super Bowl where everybody smiles and the logo appears over a sunset. For a while, I honestly believed that was enough, that this was the life I'd live until retirement, trimming hedges, laying sod, fixing sprinklers, building something stable for my kid. Then came the night of March 15th. Melanie and Skyler were driving home from Skyler's volleyball tournament in Boulder that night, just another normal Saturday in what I thought was our pretty ordinary life. They'd called me from the parking lot, Skyler bubbling over because she'd nailed a couple of great serves and Melanie laughing in the background, telling me they'd pick up milk on the way back. A drunk driver blew through a red light at close to 90 miles an hour and hit them broadside. That's what the police told me later, using words like impact, intersection, and fatalities. In that careful tone they must practice in training, they said they died instantly, that their bodies shut down before their brains could register pain, like that was supposed to be some kind of comfort, as if knowing they didn't suffer in those last seconds could somehow fill the crater their absence blasted right through the center of my chest. The days that followed felt like walking through fog with weights tied to my feet. The funeral might as well have been a movie I only half watched, faces blurred, voices muffled, time broken into strange little pieces I couldn't hold on to. My brother Colton flew in from Colorado Springs and quietly took over the logistics, talking to the funeral home, dealing with paperwork, choosing flower arrangements, all the things I should have been doing as a husband and father but couldn't because I could barely string two thoughts together. My parents, Dorothy and Mitchell Wade, got in their car in Clearwater, Florida and drove straight through, taking shifts behind the wheel so they wouldn't have to stop. When they finally walked through my front door, Mom wrapped her arms around me and I completely fell apart, sobbing into her shoulder like I was 10 years old again, her own tears soaking through the fabric of my suit jacket. "You need to eat something, Brennan," she kept saying over and over, gently pushing plates of food in front of me that I couldn't taste, that I mostly just stared at until they went cold. "Melanie wouldn't want you to waste away." But Melanie wasn't there to want anything anymore. Neither was Skyler, who had her mother's laugh, bright and musical, and my stubborn streak that made every argument last twice as long as it needed to. Their absence turned our home into a mausoleum. Every room echoed with memories. Skyler's sneakers kicked off by the door, Melanie's coffee cup still on the counter, the half-finished painting project in the hallway. I couldn't walk past their bedrooms without feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs, so I started avoiding those parts of the house entirely. First, I moved into the small office, sleeping on the futon surrounded by unpaid bills and client files. Then I started crashing in my truck in the driveway, convinced the smaller space would hurt less somehow. Eventually, I stopped really sleeping at all, just dozing in fits and starts with the TV on for background noise, hoping the sound would drown out my own thoughts. The business went downhill faster than I'd ever imagined possible. Wade Landscaping had taken years to build and only months to unravel. I missed meetings because I couldn't drag myself out of bed. I forgot to return calls because I didn't want to talk to anyone. Invoices piled up unpaid on the desk. Clients who had once trusted me started sending polite emails at first, then impatient ones, then stopped reaching out entirely. My foreman, Carlos, a guy who'd been with me almost from the beginning, tried his best to keep everything afloat. He picked up extra hours, juggled crews, smoothed things over with customers, but he couldn't replace the piece I was supposed to play, the owner who shook hands, made bids, and promised results. Without me out there securing new contracts and maintaining relationships, the work dried up. Jobs we used to win automatically started going to other companies. One by one, I had to call in my employees and let them go, each conversation feeling like another small funeral. "It's not your fault, boss," Carlos told me on his last day, standing in the empty garage with his work gloves stuffed into his back pocket, refusing to take the extra severance I tried to push into his hands. You take care of yourself first. The rest will come back when you're ready. But the truth was, I never felt ready. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks blurred into months, and all of it melted into this gray smear of time where nothing good happened and nothing got better. I sold the company trucks one by one to pay off the business loans that didn't care I was grieving. I sold our house, the place where Skyler had taken her first steps and where Melanie had painted the kitchen her favorite shade of yellow, to cover medical bills and funeral costs. Even though in theory the insurance should have handled most of it. Turned out there were complications, fine print, exclusions, processing issues, things I'd never bothered to read because whoever thinks they'll need that part of the policy. When the dust settled, I ended up in a studio apartment on the wrong side of Federal Boulevard, the kind of neighborhood where sirens were more common than birdsong, and you could hear every argument, every crying baby, every slammed door through the thin walls. The hot water worked about half the time, and when it did, it never stayed hot long enough. Colton tried his best not to let me slip through the cracks. He'd drive up every weekend from Colorado Springs with bags of groceries, talking about work, sports, anything that might pull me out of my head, always with that worried look carved into his face. "You can't live like this, Brennan," he'd tell me, glancing around at the empty pizza boxes, the unwashed dishes, the piles of unopened mail scattered across the table. "Come stay with me and Jenna for a while, just until you get your feet under you again." "I'm fine," I'd say automatically, even when I clearly wasn't, picking at a stale slice of pizza like it was a gourmet meal. "Just need some time to figure things out." Mom called every single day at exactly 7 p.m. Florida time, like clockwork, her name lighting up my phone screen with a mixture of comfort and guilt. "Your father and I have plenty of room," she'd remind me, her voice carrying that particular brand of motherly worry that somehow wraps around your chest, even over a phone line. "You could help your dad with his fishing charter business. The sunshine would do you good. You don't have to stay out there alone." But I couldn't bring myself to pack up and move in with them. These were the people who raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who showed up to every milestone in my life, and somehow I had still managed to lose everything they'd watched me build. What kind of son was I? What kind of man loses his wife and daughter and then can't even keep the business going in their honor? The eviction notice came on a Tuesday, folded neatly and taped to my door like a polite threat. 7 days to pay or vacate. That's what it said. I checked my bank account and saw exactly $43 staring back at me, with a credit card that had already tapped out months ago. No savings, no backup plan, no miracle coming. That afternoon, walking to the corner store to buy instant ramen and cheap coffee, I noticed an ad on the side of a bus stop bench. Bone marrow donors needed. Immediate compensation, $1,000 for qualified candidates. I stopped in my tracks and read it twice, maybe 3 times. $1,000. Enough to buy another month in that tiny apartment, maybe even 2 if I stretched it carefully. It felt like the universe tossing me one last lifeline, and I was desperate enough to grab it without asking too many questions. Enough money to buy myself a little more time, I told myself. Enough of a cushion to at least think about what came next, even though I honestly had no clue what that next was supposed to look like anymore. So I pulled out my phone. The same phone I kept paying for even when I couldn't cover other bills, just because it still held Melanie and Skyler's last voicemail, and I dialed the number from the ad. "Denver Medical Research Center," a cheerful woman answered, her voice bright in a way that felt completely out of sync with the gray mess of my life. "How can I help you today?" "I saw your ad about bone marrow donation," I said, standing there on the sidewalk while cars whooshed past and people hurried by with coffees and shopping bags, living normal lives. "What do I need to qualify?" "Mostly just good health and a willingness to help save lives," she replied without missing a beat. "We can go over the detailed criteria at your visit. Are you able to come in tomorrow morning for screening?" Good health. Physically, I was fine. My blood pressure was decent, my heart still beat, my legs still worked. It was everything else that was shattered, my mind, my spirit, my sense of purpose. But they didn't need to know that part. They weren't screening for grief or broken hearts. They just needed bone marrow, and I desperately needed their $1,000. "Yeah," I said, already trying to stretch that number in my head, dividing rent, utilities, and groceries like I was doing some miserable word problem. "I'll be there." The next morning, after the paperwork and the blood draw, Dr. Thorne left me alone in the exam room while they ran the tests. About 40 minutes later, I was still sitting there on the examination table, scrolling through my phone and looking at cheap apartment listings I might actually be able to afford once the donation money cleared, when the door opened again. The change in his expression hit me before he even spoke. His face had lost every trace of color, and his hands actually shook as he clutched my chart against his chest like a shield. Mr. Wade, I need to ask you something very important, he said, dragging a chair over and sitting down in front of me. This is going to sound unusual, but I need you to answer honestly. Were you adopted? The question blindsided me. It was so far out of left field that for a second I just blinked at him. No, I said, frowning. Of course not. Why would you ask me that? He adjusted his glasses, clearly rattled. Your genetic markers triggered an alert in CODIS when we ran the standard screening panel, he explained. That's the FBI's combined DNA index system. It's mainly used to flag criminal records or connect evidence to known individuals, but your sample did something I've never seen in 20 years of practice. My mouth went dry. What do you mean? Did something? I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. Before he could answer, the door opened again, only this time the energy in the room shifted completely. Two men in dark suits walked in with that measured, controlled movement that just screams government. Everything about them, haircuts, posture, the way they scanned the room, radiated federal authority. The older one stepped forward and pulled out a badge in one smooth, practiced motion. Ah, Mr. Wade, my name is Agent Raymond Holt, he said, his tone calm but heavy. I'm with the FBI. This is my partner, Agent Derek Polson. We need you to come with us immediately. There was no question mark at the end of that sentence. It wasn't a suggestion. Why? I asked, my heart slamming against my ribs. What is this about? I just volunteered to donate bone marrow. Agent Holt didn't look away. Your DNA matches a cold case from 1981, he said. Specifically, the profile of a kidnapped infant named Theodore Augustus Ashford III. I shot up from the table so fast I nearly knocked the rolling stool over, my back hitting the wall with a dull thud. That's ridiculous, I said, trying to steady my breathing. I'm Brennan Wade. My parents are Dorothy and Mitchell Wade. I grew up in Colorado. I've got baby pictures, a birth certificate, a social security number I've been using for almost 4 decades. All of which can be fabricated with enough money and motivation, Agent Holt said evenly, his expression never changing. Theodore Ashford was 3 months old when he vanished from his nursery in Greenwich, Connecticut. He paused just long enough for that to sink in. His family, the Ashfords, are worth approximately $2.8 billion. They've been looking for him for 43 years. The younger agent, Polson, stepped forward and pulled a tablet from his pocket, unlocking it with a quick swipe. He turned the screen toward me. A photograph filled the display. A baby dressed in an elaborate white christening gown, surrounded by adults in formal clothes, the kind of picture that practically smelled like old money and country clubs. The DNA match is 99.97% conclusive, Agent Polson said, like he was reading a weather report. The infant who disappeared had a rare genetic marker, a specific sequence found in only about 1 in 7 million people. You have that exact marker, Mr. Wade. Statistically speaking, the odds of this being a coincidence are almost non-existent. I stared at the screen, at that tiny baby with the serious eyes and the fancy outfit, and for a moment I felt like I was looking at a stranger and a mirror at the same time. But your file says he died, I argued, grabbing at whatever scraps of logic I could find in this mess. You literally just told me I'm listed as deceased in 1981, so how in the world am I supposed to be this missing kid if your records already say he's dead and buried? Agent Holt's expression tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening, like this was the part of the conversation he'd been hoping to avoid. Someone wanted the world to believe that Theodore Ashford was dead, he said slowly. Someone with enough resources and determination to build an entirely new identity around an infant, complete with paperwork, medical records, school documents, and everything else that can survive 4 decades of casual scrutiny. Our job is to figure out who did this and why they did it. My phone suddenly started ringing on the counter beside the examination table, the sound way too loud in the small room. The screen lit up with Mom and the photo I'd taken of her last Christmas, wearing the goofy sweater Skyler had picked out, a red one with a cartoon reindeer and blinking lights. My hand moved toward it automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of nights of answering at exactly that time. Don't answer that, Agent Holt ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut through everything else, his hand drifting toward his hip where I knew his weapon was probably holstered. Until we know more, you cannot contact anyone from your current life. Not your parents, not your brother, not friends, no one. You can't just cut me off from my family, I snapped, feeling anger finally break through the shock like a dam giving way. They'll panic. My mom calls every single night at 7 on the dot. If I don't pick up, she'll assume I've been hurt or worse. Something has happened to you, Agent Polson said quietly, his tone softer than his partner's but still firm as concrete. You've just been told your entire life might be built on a false foundation. The people who raised you might be connected to one of the most famous kidnapping cases in American history. Don't you dare, I said, my voice dropping low, a warning rumble I barely recognized as my own. Don't you dare suggest my parents are criminals. They're good people. My dad spent 30 years working at a paper mill until his back gave out and he physically couldn't lift boxes anymore. My mom was a school secretary, the kind of woman who remembered every kid's name and kept extra snacks in her drawer. They drove a 10-year-old Honda that rattled on the highway and collected coupons out of the newspaper at the kitchen table. These are not people who run in billionaire circles, which is exactly what makes them ideal, Agent Holt countered. Not unkindly, but with a cold kind of logic. Anonymous, hardworking, ordinary. People who don't raise suspicion. Tell me something, Mr. Wade. Do you have any clear memories from before age 5? Any photographs of your mother pregnant with you? Any relatives who talk about the day you were born? I opened my mouth to fire back, to list off examples that would prove how wrong they were. But when I actually reached for those memories, it felt like grabbing smoke. I remembered birthday parties and scraped knees, but nothing from when I was very small, just stories my parents had told me. Mom always said the pregnancy photos were lost in a move-in between apartments back when they were young and broke. Dad claimed early baby pictures had been ruined in some basement flood before they bought their first house. And relatives? Both my parents were supposedly only children. Their parents, my so-called grandparents, were dead before I was born. No family reunions, no cousins, no aunts and uncles telling embarrassing stories. Just me, Mom, Dad, and later Colton. We've already dispatched agents to bring them in for questioning, Agent Polson said, glancing down at his phone as if he'd just gotten an update. They're being picked up right now. My blood turned icy cold, my skin prickling as if someone had opened a freezer door inside my chest. You're arresting my parents, I asked, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. For their protection and yours, Holt clarified quickly, though the explanation did nothing to calm the storm in my head. If you are Theodore Ashford, then whoever planned this situation might try to keep them quiet, or try to use them. The moment your DNA entered our system, you stopped being just Brennan Wade. You became a very visible target. A short time later, they drove me to a federal building downtown. The place had that unmistakable government look, tall, gray, too many windows, and an American flag out front snapping in the wind. Inside, security was tight. We passed through metal detectors manned by guards who didn't bother smiling, even out of politeness. They checked IDs, scanned bags, and watched everyone with the kind of alert focus that made my skin crawl. Agent Holt walked ahead, flashing his badge, while Agent Polson stayed slightly behind me, like he was making sure I didn't bolt. We rode an elevator up several floors, the ride silent except for the soft hum of machinery and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. They led me through a maze of nearly identical hallways, cream-colored walls, gray carpet, fluorescent lights, people in suits walking quickly with files in their hands. Finally, we stepped into a small conference room. No windows, one rectangular table, 4 chairs, a blank whiteboard. The walls felt oddly close, like they were leaning in to listen. Have a seat, Mr. Wade, Holt said, though it sounded less like an invitation and more like a directive. I sat, my hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles ached. He opened a folder and began spreading photographs across the table like cards in the worst poker game imaginable. There was the baby in the christening gown again, clearer this time, his tiny face serious, almost thoughtful, surrounded by adults in formal clothes who looked like they'd stepped out of some old society magazine. Another photo showed a huge estate, a stone mansion sitting on a hill with rolling green lawns, a fountain, and a long driveway lined with trees. It looked like something from a film, the kind of place you only see if you're really rich or delivering packages. Then came the newspaper clippings, old and yellowed in some images, reproduced in full color in others. Bold headlines screamed about the Ashford kidnapping, phrases like "air vanishes" and "nationwide search" jumping out at me. Some articles showed search parties walking through woods. Others showed the Ashford parents, the mother with tearful eyes and the father looking grim but determined, standing behind microphones at press conferences. Holt slid over a series of images labeled with ages, 5, 10, 18, 25, 30, 40. Age-progressed composites, he explained, tracing a finger along the sequence. These were created over the years to help keep the case alive in the public's mind, ways to show what Theodore might look like if he was still out there. When my eyes reached the one labeled age 40, my breath caught in my throat. It was like staring at a slightly altered version of my driver's license photo. Same general jawline, same eye shape, even the same faint crease between the eyebrows that showed up when I frowned. The Ashfords never stopped searching, Holt said quietly. They funded private investigators, paid for billboards, kept the case active in the media. To this day, they maintain a foundation dedicated to finding missing children. And now, for the first time in 43 years, we have a DNA match that says their son might not have died after all. Agent Holt continued speaking in that calm, measured voice of his, while he arranged the photos and documents on the table with this methodical precision that made everything feel even more real. Your biological father, Augustus Ashford, is 89 years old now, he said. He's spent millions over the decades on private investigators, age progression specialists, even fringe avenues like psychics and so-called intuitives, all trying to get some hint of what happened to his son. Your biological mother, Vivienne, passed away 5 years ago, he added, and there was the slightest shift in his tone, like he actually felt sorry about that part. She died never knowing what happened to her baby. Something inside me twisted at that, but I shoved the feeling down and pushed the photos away with more force than I meant to. This is wrong, I insisted, shaking my head. You've got the wrong story here. My parents are good people. They wouldn't kidnap a child. They wouldn't take someone else's baby and raise him as their own. They couldn't. You don't know them the way I do. You don't know the kind of life we had. We've already dispatched agents to bring them in for questioning, Agent Polson said, glancing at his phone like he was reading a weather update instead of talking about my family. They're cooperating fully. Your father, Mitchell Wade, actually seemed relieved when our agents arrived. That word hit me sideways. Relieved? I repeated, unable to hide the disbelief in my voice. You're dragging 2 elderly people out of their retirement community and he's relieved? That doesn't make any sense. Polson tapped his screen and read something directly from the report. According to the initial interview, his first words when agents identified themselves were, "I knew this day would come." Before I could respond to that or even decide how I felt, the conference room door opened again. A woman stepped in, and it was like the air changed temperature by a few degrees, going sharper, thinner. She carried herself with this quiet elegance that didn't need any explanation, tailored dark suit, simple jewelry, hair perfectly styled in soft silver waves. She looked like the kind of person who had grown up being told to sit up straight and speak clearly at charity dinners. Her movements were controlled and deliberate, every step measured, but when her eyes landed on me, she stopped like she'd hit an invisible wall. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, one hand flying up to cover her mouth as if she needed to physically hold the sound in. "You have his eyes. You have Tommy's eyes." Agent Holt stepped slightly to the side, giving her room. "This is Cordelia Ashford Northman," he said. "Your biological sister." The words biological sister landed like a second impact from a wreck I hadn't finished feeling the first hit from. She moved toward me slowly, the way someone might approach a wild animal that might bolt or lash out if spooked. Tears slid down her cheeks in steady lines, but she didn't bother wiping them away. It was like she didn't even notice them. "Teddy," she said softly, her voice breaking on the name. "We called you Teddy. I was 7 when you disappeared. I used to sneak into your nursery at night just to make sure you were still breathing. I was terrified something would happen to you, and then something did, and I've carried that with me for 43 years. You were 7, I said automatically, the words coming out before I even really thought them through. It wasn't your fault. How could it have been? I was supposed to protect you, she insisted, shaking her head. Her hand lifted toward my face, stopping just short of touching my cheek, like she was afraid if she made contact I'd vanish. I was your big sister. That was my job. The night you disappeared, I begged Mom to let me sleep over at my friend's house instead of staying home. If I'd been there, maybe I could have heard something, maybe I would have noticed a door opening or a window moving. Maybe I could have done something. She looked absolutely wrecked by the memory, and for a second I saw a scared 7-year-old girl underneath the polished woman standing in front of me. Looking at her felt surreal, like staring into a funhouse mirror that showed an alternate version of my own face. We shared the same general nose shape, the same line of the jaw, and the same green eyes with those little gold flecks near the center. The ones my mom Dorothy always said made me look like a cat when the light hit just right. Only now I had to wonder whose eyes she'd really been talking about all those years. The resemblance between Cordelia and me was undeniable, etched into our faces, written into our bones, made louder by the photos of the baby between us. We need your help, Mr. Wade, Agent Holt said, cutting gently through the emotional haze. Or maybe I should say, Mr. Ashford. Will you agree to submit to additional testing, meet with Augustus, and help us piece together how a child named Theodore Ashford supposedly died while a boy named Brennan Wade appeared out of nowhere? What kind of additional testing are we talking about? I asked. Though if I was honest with myself, I already knew I wasn't going to refuse. The truth felt like a runaway train now, and I was standing on the tracks. I could either climb aboard or get flattened trying to pretend it wasn't coming. More comprehensive DNA panels, Holt explained, ticking them off like items on a checklist, full fingerprints for comparison to hospital records, medical imaging to look for any physical markers described in the original investigation file. For instance, the case notes mention that Theodore had a small birthmark on his left shoulder blade. Do you have any distinguishing marks there? My mind immediately jumped to the crescent-shaped mark on my back, the one Melanie used to trace lightly with her finger when we were lying in bed, calling it my lucky moon. Yeah, I said slowly, feeling my throat tighten. I do, actually. Cordelia made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, like her body couldn't decide whether to release joy or grief first. Oh, Teddy, she whispered, pressing her fingertips to her lips as if she needed to hold herself together. That little moon, Mom used to say that birthmark was proof the universe kissed you before you arrived. Hearing that nearly knocked the air out of me, because it sounded exactly like something Dorothy might have said too, only now I had to wonder whose stories I'd really been living under all this time. Teddy had that mark, Cordelia said, her voice almost reverent. Mom used to kiss it every single night after his bath, like it was some sort of blessing she was placing on him before he went to sleep. The room tilted around me, the fluorescent lights blurring at the edges, and I had to grab the edge of the table just to keep myself upright, my fingers digging into the wood. I want to see my parents first, I managed, my throat tight. The Wades. Before I do anything else, before more tests or meetings or reunions, I need to see them. They deserve to know this isn't their fault. They deserve to hear directly from me that no matter what the DNA says, they're still my parents. Holt took a slow breath, clearly weighing something in his mind, then gave a short nod. That can be arranged, he said. They're being brought here now. But Mr. Wade, you need to prepare yourself. They may have answers you're not ready to hear. After today, I said, letting my eyes drift over the photos spread across the table, the estate, the baby, the age-progressed images of a life I never lived, I don't think I'll ever be ready for anything again. But I still need to know, all of it. No more half-truths, no more guessing. The reunion with my parents didn't happen in that cold conference room. They moved us to a smaller space down the hall, a room that tried its best to look less like an interrogation cell and more like a counseling office. The lighting was warmer, the chairs were padded instead of metal, and there was even a small painting on the wall of mountains and trees, like someone thought a bit of scenery might help people talk. When the door opened and they brought Dorothy and Mitchell Wade in, everything inside me clenched. Mom took one look at me, at my face, and her knees just gave out. She crumpled like someone had cut her strings. Dad caught her a split second before she hit the floor, his arms wrapping around her as his own face collapsed. All the strength I'd always seen in him suddenly cracked wide open. We need to tell him, Dot, Dad said, his voice breaking in a way I had never heard in my entire life, not even at Melanie and Skyler's funeral. We should have told him years ago. Mom pressed her face into his shoulder and sobbed, her entire body shaking with it, like this was something she'd been holding back for decades and could finally let out. When she finally lifted her head and looked at me, her eyes were heavy with guilt, like she'd been carrying a weight too big for one person. We loved you so much, Brennan, she said, the words tripping over each other. You have to understand that we loved you like our own, more than our own, if that's even possible. What are you talking about? I asked, the walls seeming to tilt again. I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself, afraid my legs might follow Mom's example and quit on me. Mom, please, just tell me what's going on. No more hints. No more, we'll talk later. Dad helped her into one of the chairs, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out his old leather wallet. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 2 tries to open it. From behind his driver's license, he slid out a yellowed business card, the edges soft from years of being handled and rehandled. December 1981, he said quietly, staring at the card like it was some kind of curse. Your mother had just lost another pregnancy, our 5th miscarriage. The doctors told us we'd never have children of our own, at least not naturally. I was working the night shift at the mill back then, he continued, voice distant, like he was replaying the memory on an old projector in his mind, when a woman came to our door. Mom picked up the story with a trembling whisper. She was crying, holding a baby. You were so small, Brennan, barely 3 months old. She said she was your aunt. She told us your parents had died in a car accident in Canada and that she couldn't keep you for legal or financial reasons. She had everything, Dad added, wiping his palms on his pants like they still felt sweaty from that night. Documents, birth certificate, medical records, even photographs of a young couple she said were your parents. They looked enough like us that we could believe they were relatives from some distant branch of the family tree. She offered us $50,000 to take you, Mom whispered. No questions asked, Dad finished, the words hanging heavy in the air. We should have known something was wrong. The money, the flawless paperwork, the way she disappeared afterward without leaving a phone number or address. But Brennan, we were so desperate for a child. And there you were, this perfect, beautiful baby who needed a home. You bought me? I said, the words coming out strangled and raw. You literally bought a baby. We didn't see it that way, Mom said, instinctively reaching a hand toward me, then stopping halfway when she saw me step back. The money was supposed to be for you, for your care, your future. We put it into a college fund. Every single penny went toward raising you, not into our pockets. From the corner of the room, Agent Holt had been quietly recording everything, his phone angled just enough to capture the conversation. He stepped forward now, his expression focused, professional, but not completely cold. Can you describe this woman in as much detail as possible? He asked. Anything you remember? The way she talked, what she wore, any little detail might help us identify her. Blonde, maybe 35, Dad said slowly, closing his eyes as he dug through 43-year-old memories. Shoulder-length hair, styled like the actresses your mother used to watch on TV. She wore a dark blue coat, I think, and carried one of those structured purses. She sounded educated, not local. Her accent was polished, like someone who'd been to good schools. Mom nodded, her face pinched as she reached back through time. She had a small scar near her right eyebrow, she added. I remember noticing it when she leaned over your crib, and she smelled like expensive perfume, the kind I'd never be able to afford. I remember thinking she looked completely out of place in our tiny house, like she'd stepped out of another world and into ours just long enough to change it forever. Elegant like she came from money, Dad continued, his brow furrowing as the memory sharpened. Her coat looked expensive, good fabric that hung just right, and she wore jewelry that didn't look like costume pieces. They had the weight and shine of the real thing. She had a scar on her left hand shaped like a crescent moon, right here, he added, tracing the spot on his own skin. I noticed it when she handed you to Dorothy. That detail hit Cordelia like a physical blow. She gasped out loud, her hand flying to her chest. Margaret Ashford, she whispered, our father's younger sister. She had that exact scar from a riding accident when she was 12. I stared at her, at my parents, at the agents, trying to connect all these pieces that felt like they belonged to different puzzles. But why? I asked, my voice rough. Why would she steal me from my family and then hand me off to strangers states away? What possible reason would she have to do something like that? Before anyone could answer, the door opened again, and the room seemed to rearrange itself around the presence of the man who entered. An elderly man in a wheelchair rolled in, pushed by a nurse in a plain uniform. Even sitting down, even clearly weakened by age, Augustus Ashford carried himself with the kind of weight that doesn't come from muscles, but from decades of power and responsibility. His hair was thin and white, his skin mapped with lines, but his eyes, my eyes, were sharp and focused, locking onto me with an intensity that made everything else fade into the background. Because she thought she was protecting you, he said, his voice still surprisingly strong despite the years. Protecting you from me, from what I'd become. The nurse eased his chair closer to the table, and he studied my face like he was memorizing it, like he was checking every angle against 43 years of grief and imagination. Margaret discovered something she was never meant to know, he continued. My business partners back then weren't just investors. They were tied to organized crime, to money laundering, to the kind of people who don't accept no as an answer. When she learned they were planning to kidnap you for ransom, she moved first. She took you before they could, and then she faked your death to throw them off and stop the hunt. Cordelia stepped closer to his side, our side, her hand tightening on the back of his wheelchair. Then she disappeared, Cordelia added quietly. We found her body 2 years later in a hotel room in Montreal. The authorities ruled it a suicide. She never told anyone where you were. Augustus reached into a worn leather bag hanging from the side of his wheelchair and pulled out an envelope that looked older than I was. Yellowed edges, heavy paper, sealed with dark red wax, stamped with some family crest. She left this with her lawyer, he said, his voice trembling for the first time. Instructions were clear. It could only be opened if you were ever found. We've been waiting 43 years to read it. Agent Holt stepped forward and accepted the envelope like it was a piece of evidence and a holy relic at the same time. He carefully broke the wax seal, unfolded several pages of neat, elegant handwriting, and began to read aloud. As Margaret Ashford's confession spilled into the room, it was like listening to a ghost finally tell her side of the story. She confirmed everything and then went even further. Augustus's partners hadn't just planned to kidnap me and hold me for ransom. They intended to kill me no matter what. payment or no payment, to send a message about what happened to anyone who tried to walk away from their organization or betray them. She wrote that she couldn't go to the police because those same men had their hooks in too many people in power already. Judges, officers, politicians. If she went to the authorities, she believed it would only speed up my death and possibly her own. So she made me disappear instead. She researched for months, quietly and carefully, until she found what she believed was the perfect couple. Good, honest people in another state, far from the Ashford name and influence, far from the reach of dangerous men. People who desperately wanted a child and would protect him with everything they had. "She saved your life," Augustus said, tears tracking down the deep lines of his face. "And I have hated her for 43 years for nothing," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of it. 3 weeks later, I stood just inside the massive entrance hall of the Ashford estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, feeling like I'd accidentally wandered onto the set of a movie. Marble floors stretched out beneath my boots. A sweeping staircase split into 2 directions. Chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, scattering light across polished wood, and framed paintings of people who, apparently, were my ancestors. The DNA tests had come back by then, not just from one source, but 3 separate independent laboratories. Every report said the same thing. I was Theodore Augustus Ashford III, heir to a fortune I'd never heard of, son of a family that had mourned me every single day for 43 years. But I was also still Brennan Wade, the man raised in a modest house by a mill worker and a school secretary who packed my lunches, sat in metal bleachers for my games, and taught me how to be decent even when life wasn't. Both truths sat side by side inside my chest, constantly bumping into each other. The legal process moved quicker than I thought it would, probably helped along by the Ashford name and the FBI's involvement. Dorothy and Mitchell Wade weren't charged with anything. Investigators dug deep and concluded what I already knew in my bones. They had been victims too, pulled into a nightmare they never asked for. They were manipulated by a desperate aunt who was trying to save a baby's life using the only terrible tools she believed she had. They raised me in good faith, trusting the story they were given, pouring everything they had into me, even in the years when everything didn't amount to much on paper. When the dust settled, Augustus made an announcement in that firm, no-argument tone of his. He was setting up a trust fund for Dorothy and Mitchell in the amount of $10 million, he said, to ensure their retirement was as comfortable and secure as possible. It was his way of saying thank you, and I'm sorry in the only language he'd really known for most of his life, money. Watching my parents react to that, the shock, the refusal, the eventual tearful acceptance, felt almost as surreal as hearing I was an heir. Because underneath all the numbers, titles, and estates, there was one simple fact tying us all together. 2 families, one by blood and one by choice, had spent decades loving the same kid without even knowing they were sharing him. "They raised my son when I couldn't protect him," Augustus said quietly during one of the final paperwork signings, his thin hand resting on the table, the pen trembling slightly between his fingers. "Money can't repay that, not really, but it can at least make sure they never have to worry about anything again for as long as they live." When Mom heard about the trust, she cried the kind of tears I'd only seen a few times in my life, the kind that come from somewhere deep. "We didn't raise you for money, Brennan," she told me, clutching my hands like she was afraid someone might still try to take me away. "We raised you because you were ours from the moment that woman put you in my arms. In my heart, you were my son before I even knew your name. The arrangement we came up with after the legal dust settled was unconventional, but it worked for us, at least for now. I basically split my life down the middle. Weekends belong to the Wades in Florida, where Dad takes me out on his boat at sunrise and teaches me how to bait hooks and read the tide like he's been doing it his whole life, and Mom still insists on making my favorite pot roast, even though the Ashford chefs could prepare any fancy meal I wanted. We play cards at their kitchen table, argue about the best way to season potatoes, and watch old game shows like nothing has changed except the size of their bank account and the suit I'm wearing. Weekdays, I live at the Ashford estate in Connecticut, where the ceilings are high, the staff is polite, and I'm constantly learning how to exist in a world I never expected to step into. Cordelia walks me through it piece by piece. She sits beside me in board meetings and leans over to quietly explain terms I don't recognize, or nudges me when it's my turn to speak. She helps me pick the right suit for charity galas, reminds me who's who when we walk into rooms full of people who grew up knowing the Ashford name like it was part of their weather report, and gently corrects me when I forget which fork to use at formal dinners. It's like trying to learn a new language while everyone else has been fluent since birth, but she never makes me feel stupid for asking basic questions. Augustus and I spend long afternoons in his study, a room that smells like leather and old books, with walls covered in framed photographs of a family I'm still getting to know in pieces. He pulls photos off the shelves and tells me stories about my biological mother, Vivienne, who died 5 years ago still wearing a small locket with my baby picture inside. He says she refused to take it off, even when people gently suggested it might help her move on. She never gave up hope that you were alive somewhere, he told me one evening as we watched the sunset bleed across the sky through tall windows. Even when the police insisted there was no evidence, even when the investigators told us to accept the worst, she prayed every day that you'd been taken, not killed, because that meant you could still be found. She would have loved to see the man you became, he added, tears shining in his eyes. You have her kindness. Even after losing your wife and daughter, even after your life fell apart, you walked into that clinic trying to help someone else by donating bone marrow. That's Vivian's spirit showing through, whether you knew her or not. Eventually, the FBI officially closed the cold case that had hovered over the Ashford family for most of my life. The resolution wasn't something anyone could have predicted back in 1981. In the final reports, Margaret Ashford, once whispered about as unstable and selfish, became a strange kind of hero. Flawed, desperate, but brave enough to burn her own life down to keep a child from men who would have hurt him. The criminals she'd been so afraid of were long gone by the time the case wrapped up, dead, imprisoned on unrelated charges, or rotting away in forgotten corners of the system. Their threat no longer reached into the present, but back when I was 3 months old, they were very real. The most powerful moment for me, though, didn't happen in a mansion or a government building. It happened when I flew back to Denver and returned to that cramped studio apartment one last time. The eviction notice was still taped crookedly to the peeling door, flapping a little whenever the hallway draft moved. Technically, it meant nothing now. I could have paid off the entire building, bought the block, torn it down, whatever. But standing there with my old key in my hand, staring at that piece of paper, it felt like a symbol of everything I'd been and everything I was leaving behind. I thought about the version of me who had stood on that sidewalk reading a bus bench advertisement, willing to sell his own bone marrow just to buy another month of life in a place where the hot water barely worked. That man had no idea that the same DNA test meant to protect donors would unravel his entire existence. He never could have imagined that the worst pain he'd ever experienced, the loss of Melanie and Skyler, would eventually, in some twisted, indirect way, lead him to a truth that changed everything. I carefully peeled the eviction notice off the door and kept it. Today, it hangs in a simple black frame on the wall of my office at the Ashford Foundation, where I now work full-time overseeing charitable programs for families in crisis. In the 6 months since I stepped into that role, we've directed over $50 million into projects focused on families who've lost children, parents who feel like they're hanging on by a thread, and people who are trying to rebuild their lives after tragedy knocked their foundations out from under them. We fund grief counseling, emergency housing, scholarships for kids who lost a caregiver, and small business grants for people starting over from nothing, just like I once tried to do with Wade Landscaping. Every program I approve feels like a small way of honoring both my families. Dorothy calls me every morning at 7, just like she always has, only now the calls sometimes come while I'm looking over multi-million-dollar proposal reports. "Good morning, my sweet boy," she says, and I can hear the smile in her voice clear as day. "I don't care how many fancy titles you get or what your last name is now. You'll always be my Brennan." On Fridays, Augustus insists on taking me to dinner at his club, a place with dark wood paneling, old portraits, and waiters who've known him for decades. He introduces me to people who remember me as a baby, who joined search parties, donated money to reward funds, and watched the news for updates for years. They shake my hand with tears in their eyes, and some of them hug me like a long-lost relative. "You'll always be my Theodore," Augustus tells me as we leave, pride thick in his voice. My boy came home after all. The truth is, they're both right. The DNA tests did more than just slap a label on my identity. They showed me that family isn't just a matter of bloodlines, last names, or bank balances. It's the people who show up for you when you're broken, who love you enough to raise you as their own, who search for you across decades, or who risk everything to protect you from danger you'll never see. It's the parents who taught me to ride a bike and eat my vegetables, and the parents who kept a nursery ready long after it should have been packed away. I was born Theodore Augustus Ashford III. I was raised as Brennan Wade. I was almost destroyed by the night I lost Melanie and Skyler. But somewhere in all that loss and confusion, I discovered something I never expected. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are, even if who you are is a man who, on paper, supposedly died before he got the chance to live. A week ago, the donation center called and left a message asking if I still wanted to remain on the bone marrow donor registry. I didn't hesitate for even a second. I called back and said yes. After all, that simple act, walking into a clinic for quick cash, ended up saving my life in ways they will never fully understand. And somewhere out there, there's another person sitting in some small apartment, or hospital bed, or borrowed couch, hoping for a miracle. If my cells can give someone else another chance, how could I ever say no? Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary desperation. A missed payment, an eviction notice, a flyer on a bus stop bench. Mine started with a piece of paper taped to a door and led to 2 families, one intertwined truth, and the realization that Margaret Ashford, the aunt I never got to meet, may have been the bravest person in my story. She made me vanish not to erase me, but to give me a chance to live. And 4 decades later, that same act of vanishing brought me home to both of my homes. Every life has hidden chapters tucked between the obvious ones. Mine just happens to include a fortune I didn't earn, a kidnapping I don't remember, and a woman courageous enough to defy very dangerous men and rewrite the ending. If this story meant something to you, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a like and shared it with someone who might need to be reminded that even in the darkest seasons, unexpected light can still break through. And if you feel like it, leave a comment about what surprised you the most, because sometimes talking about the twists in our stories helps all of us see our own lives a little more clearly.